The thing that I still see is I think a lot of companies are just getting some sort of eval stack up and running, and they are still figuring out that their eval stack is not working. Actually, it's not really doing a great job of capturing user intent. I think there are definitely examples where companies have been very successful doing it. But I think one of the big themes that I'm kind of predicting for 2025 is there's a lot of companies that have set up eval stacks that are locked in code and don't have an unfair advantage, are not, they exist and there's some report at the end about quality, but it's not really accurately measuring how well this thing is going to work.
If you're trying to build AI products or deploy AI systems across your business, you know that testing and evaluating those systems is really, really important, not just to make sure they're accurate, but to continuously improve them over time. That's why today I'm excited to bring you Doug Safreno. Safreno is the co-founder and CEO of Gentrace AI, who recently just raised a Series A for $8 million, led by Matrix Ventures, to bring testing and evaluation to large language models in particular. We talked about common misconceptions in AI evaluation, the challenges of AI testing and evaluation, go to market for this, why we're shifting towards top-down sales in AI, the complexity of evaluating agentic systems, how you build confidence in those systems, and just generally the future of AI testing and evaluation. This is a great one. If you want to dive deep on any of those topics, give it a listen. Thanks for listening to and watching another episode of The Chief AI Officer. Today, I'm excited to bring you Doug Safreno, who is co-founder and CEO at Gentrace. Doug, thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Ben. I'm really excited for the conversation.
Yeah, me too. You guys just raised a Series A. How are things? How are you feeling?
Things are really busy. Things are also really exciting right now. I just mentioned to you before the show that we just doubled our headcount. We just did probably the biggest feature release that we've done in the history of the company. We're just in the midst of a lot of stuff going on right now. So it's super busy, super fun, but this is kind of what it's all about in the startup world, but also specifically the AI world.
Yeah. I think we're seeing growth trajectories that we haven't seen before in SaaS happening right now. Very interested to see kind of your perspective on the market, given you're working in the kind of AI testing and evaluation space. There's obviously a lot of demand for that right now. What made you focus on that as kind of, the core part of your product? What was the insight that led to that?
It was kind of funny. The co-founders all kind of come from a DevOps dev tools background. Myself and our CTO had previously built and sold a company in the VMware observability space. Our co-founder and COO did dev tools at Uber and Dropbox and companies like that. We were in late 2022, September, October kind of timeline, a month or two before ChatGPT came out. We were fine-tuning GPT-3 query models to try and build this way of chatting with your email. We were just experimenting with it. We kind of just wanted to get a feel for the technology. And what we found is that as you start building these AI systems, you end up playing Whac-A-Mole. So you solve one use case or some capability. Now I can ask a question about scheduling, and you regress on something else. I now forgot the name of this person, or forgot somebody's birthday or something like that. And so we built all these internal tools to test and monitor this. And it took us a really long time to do that. And, 6 months later, a lot of the folks that we were talking to were telling us, hey, we're building that exact same thing. Can you just build that as a company and sell that? Because we're trying to solve exactly the same problem. So we started working on Gentrace full-time in May of 2023 as the core product, doing evals, and started acquiring customers in October of 2023.
Yeah, it's exciting. I think one thing that a lot of enterprises struggle with is that these are probabilistic systems, right? For you, that's a big opportunity when it comes to testing and evaluation. And as you said, you've founded a couple different companies before in this DevOps kind of testing space. What is uniquely challenging about doing this for AI infrastructure and LLMs?
Yeah, it's kind of, you mentioned the probabilistic nature. It's interesting because I think, there are corollaries to traditional software testing, there are corollaries to traditional ML testing, but there are also just some totally new things. One of our customers, Quizlet, they built a feature where basically you can copy unstructured notes and it'll generate learning materials like flashcards or syllabuses or things of that nature. And you can imagine in like a traditional ML world, if you're just classifying, you're trying to say, oh, what is the sentiment or something like that, even though it's probabilistic, and so like you need to run a lot of data through it, it's actually relatively easy to determine like, was it right or not? And you can, it's kind of just an equality check. It got the label right or it didn't. In this new world of generative AI, there's so many things that could make like a flashcard correct or not correct to unstructured material. It could be factually incorrect. It could not be relevant to the material that was presented. The LLM could be drawing on some information that it has that is not like justified by the actual text that was passed in, and the user really wants just flashcards about this text. So there's all kinds of different things that can go wrong, which means you kind of need like very novel ways to solve the testing problem. And so we generally see kind of a combination of three ways. There are like traditional, more heuristic-y tests, but I think what's really key is doing some combination of human review and using LLMs to actually judge the material. And there's a whole, new kind of area of research around how to do that really well.
Are you seeing any common patterns in terms of companies approaching this wrong or kind of misconceptions about how they should be doing this?
Yeah, very much so. I think like pretty much everybody makes the same mistake, actually, which is they start by trying to sort of ask the LLM the same question that they prompted to generate the answer. And you're not going to actually learn a whole lot from doing that. An example of this would be like, you ask it, you say like, hey, here's what makes a good flashcard, for example, using the Quizlet analogy. And you ask it like, hey, like, is this a good flashcard using the same rubric, right? And you ask an LLM to do that judging. It's not necessarily, if you're using like a really small model to do the generation, you're using a much more sophisticated model to do the grading, it can work somewhat. But generally, we have this idea that we tell all our customers about, which is you want to give the grader some sort of unfair advantage, some access to some additional information that the original LLM did not have access to. And so ways you could do that would be, you give it a reference set of flashcards that actually a human generated. And instead of asking it, is this good according to the grading criteria, you ask it, how does it compare to this other set of flashcards? Now that's some sort of unfair advantage that the LLM has, that the grader has, that the original LLM who generated it didn't have. Or you can do things like actually say, I expect this flashcard to exist on this data point. And that's obviously not something that the system that's generating it has access to. So like these are, different types of unfair advantages. But we honestly see most companies falling into the trap of just like asking the same question again when they're grading as they're getting started with this.
Yeah, I think that's a great example in terms of just being very specific about giving it additional knowledge that the original one doesn't have, and maybe going to a higher performance model as well. Companies right now are obviously investing a ton of money into this, right? There's so many startups all over the place. Reliability, really important concern, right, in large companies, but also I think as these agentic AI startups are kind of cropping up all over the place, I think the most common thing that I'm hearing is about stuff stuck in POC, about a lot of concerns around predictability, the reliability of the outputs, particularly as you start building agentic systems that are just chaining a ton of different prompts together and different actions together. What are some of the most surprising things that you've seen in terms of getting LLMs to behave more reliably?
Yeah, I think like the challenges definitely only go up as you start moving into agentic systems. Generally, I think like, another tip that we tend to give folks is to try and observe, try and make sure you have a representative data set, and then try and actually look at the outputs and observe basically how is this thing messing up? Because there's only so much you can do from like an eval standpoint when you're initially getting set up in terms of like making sure you're going to have an eval set that captures everything. And this is something that kind of informs our product philosophy at Gentrace a lot. Within the sort of category of different eval tools, we consider ourselves like the collaborative LLM testing environment, where we really try and like actually put the outputs front and center and make it really easy for you to go from, okay, I'm looking at an output, to I can make evals, tailor evals that are really specific on like making sure this thing isn't messing up. Because what we see a lot is, again, companies building evals, but then like still it gets stuck in POC because like still the product manager comes in and tries like 3 things and one of them doesn't work, or somebody who's, not super deep in the evals is still able to break it very easily. So it's a really common pattern.
I actually spoke to someone 2 days ago that they're building kind of like multi-agent customer service tools, and they were saying that evals were a huge part of their go-to-market. Like they're going in and they're kind of using evals to stress test current systems, simulate thousands of conversations and things like that, and then benchmark them against their current systems. Are you seeing things like that in the space too? Are you involved with customers in that way? Or are you really working internally with large companies of like, they have a specific use case and they're trying to figure out like, how do we deploy this and how do we make it better?
Yeah, I mean, we work with companies that are kind of across the board. We have one customer, I can't name, but they're, multi-billion-dollar company in the knowledge space based in SF. And they're building a chat interface for a very large set of very unstructured data, right? And it's maybe a little bit analogous to your customer support thing. It's probably even a harder problem than customer success, because customer success, you're really operating on a set of docs, right? It's like an agent on top of a set of docs that are like my policies. This is an agent on top of really arbitrary data that anybody could be coming in that's like knowledge. And I think the first part of your question again was, how do you test those?
Yeah, I'm just curious, like when you're looking at, are you working with companies that are just really focused on like a single use case? You're trying to make their system better, for your example, right? Like the knowledge base, like how do we test this to make sure we're giving users the most accurate answer? Or are you also like working with companies in some capacities to like think about how they use evals as a way to go to market if you're like another AI startup, for example?
And what you had said with customer service, where they were using evals as go-to-market, were they like doing evals for companies that were not their customers and then kind of like using that as a way to show them, here's how we can make it better? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, kind of like they were just stress testing their current systems and showing like when outputs were not matching like the accurate, output that they might want as a company, and then benchmarking that against what their system could do. So maybe there isn't a connection there. I just thought it could have some connection to some of the.
Oh, yeah. I think, it's interesting. We, probably are not super deep in companies that are doing that exactly yet. But it is something that we get a lot of questions around, like, I think we have that kind of at like an internal level at like a bigger organization. Like imagine you're a stakeholder who's building some LLM feature and you're trying to sell that this should either be shipped or that this should support a bunch of other initiatives that are happening internally or something along those lines. You need like reporting to basically show how much better the system is than whatever you had before, or like the net new functionality that happens, and like to be able to sell this internally. So we definitely have that happening a lot at a lot of our customers.
Nice. And I mean, I think one thing that you mentioned when you were talking about how you're positioning Gentrace in particular, you mentioned like the collaborative evaluation. What does that mean? What are some of the crucial aspects of testing and evaluation that you think the existing solutions are missing?
Yeah, so most people start with writing evals in code, and then a lot of eval vendors essentially become like viz layers on top of the code, right? They could just sort of ingest like, hey, here are the metrics that were, the evals, and they allow you to plot those and dissect those in various ways. We're a little bit different in that our customers build out their data sets in Gentrace, they're building out their evals in Gentrace, they're looking at the outputs in Gentrace. And the reason that's really important is it allows you to hand off aspects of evaluation from an engineer to somebody who maybe is a subject matter expert. An example is that like Multiverse is another customer of ours that's in the learning space, and they actually have product managers and educators coming in and helping out with the eval, helping out with the construction of the data set, because they're frankly better positioned to answer the question of like, is this right or is it behaving the right way, than a software engineer. Part of our goal is to make it something where Gentrace is something that a software engineer can set up, but then they can like essentially leverage Gentrace as a platform for everybody to help with testing. They're not responsible for all of the testing themselves when they're not even the person who's necessarily the right person to answer the question of like, is it behaving the right way in all these different situations? So that's what we kind of mean by a collaborative testing platform, is we want to turn it into something where you can get the right people in to like help with eval, the people who really know how it should work.
Yeah, that's great. That makes a lot of sense. And obviously to do that, you also have to build a different type of product from an interface standpoint to make it easy for those, subject matter experts who might not be developers. I mean, I'm curious in terms of your go-to-market strategy a little bit, right? Like it sounds like you have a strong developer focus maybe as like you're into the account if they're the one building a lot of this stuff, but it also sounds like you're trying to expand product usage across a number of different personas. Can you walk me through how that's affecting your go-to-market strategy?
I think like generally what we're kind of trying to sell software engineers on, and I think a lot of software engineers, so I think like for us, a software engineer or somebody in that chain, director of AI engineering, somebody like that is really the buyer for eval tools. They're the ones still tasked with like fundamentally like, you got to figure out what we're doing about eval. But I think there's an increasing realization amongst those people over time that if they just go and write it in code, people aren't going to trust it, and people are not going to get involved with it. So they're going to be responsible for not just managing the eval system, but actually managing the data set, the eval data sets, the eval, exactly how they're running the evals, what they're checking for, all of these different things. And so I think what we're kind of selling to them is, hey, this product will allow you to create something that people will trust and people will help you out with. Like, you won't be the single point of failure for this. And it's not really fair to you that you are. And frankly, none of the other stakeholders want you to be either. You're only this way because it's in code. And so, because it's in code, you have to be the one to do it because you're the software engineer. But the product manager wants to be involved in eval. And they, if there are other folks who are even better at looking at eval, they want to involve those folks as well. So that's what we're kind of selling to like software engineers, director of AI engineers, all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and how are you finding getting in front of that person? How is your message resonating with them? Because I know you're solving a very important problem, but these are also people that are very hard to reach at large companies. And so are you seeing certain things work well in terms of how you are kind of bringing this solution to market?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we try and add value kind of, even if you're not at the point where you're like specifically trying to figure out evals, we try and add value by just kind of being a center of knowledge for folks building in the AI engineering space. And there's kind of two ways that we can do that. We can do that through, hey, we've seen these patterns and we kind of know what you should be doing. I think we can do more and more of that as time goes on, and we see more and more patterns, and we kind of realize more and more here are the common pitfalls. But the other thing we can do is the space is just moving so fast that a lot of times folks who are on the bleeding edge just want to talk to other folks who are on the bleeding edge and like we'll try and learn from them. And so we do dinners about once a month where we get like, call it 10 to 20 people who are pretty close to the bleeding edge on building like really sophisticated AI systems together for a dinner, and we walk through the challenges and we try and like figure out what are the techniques for solving those. And those are constantly evolving, like it's really changed you kind of it's fun for us because we get this picture of like kind of how the world's moving as we do these things. We've been doing them for about a year now. And then we also do some broader events as well, where we get, 100 plus people together, and we have some speakers and things like that. Those have been primarily how we've gotten in front of folks to date, is by sort of adding value by creating these communities where folks can learn from each other and kind of figure out all the, the impact of DeepSeek launching or whatever, whatever is the latest thing all together.
Yeah, I think that's a great strategy because I've seen that work very well for a lot of startups. It's particularly, I think what I'm noticing in this space a lot right now is it's a pretty big shift from what we've seen in SaaS for the last 15, 20 years of very product-led growth motions to a much more top-down kind of like sales-led, a lot of relationship building. Is that what you're seeing, right? You're targeting, as you said, director of engineering, CAIOs. You need to be kind of deeply embedded into their system, or like they're building with you essentially, right? So you have to go top-down, right? You're not a product-led growth product, are you?
I would say, yeah, I would say we're maybe a little bit more of a top-down, but it's interesting because there's sort of a pull from both angles. Like, I think from the top, there's this, why aren't we shipping? What do the evals say? How can I like look into the evals and make sure they're actually evaling the right thing? And so I think there's that push. It's sort of like, okay, like why are things going slower than I expected? And like, how do I help our team move fast and build trust? But I think from the bottom, there is also a little bit of a pull in terms of like, I'm like kind of lost here and I need like some guidance on how to do this the right way. And I need something that makes it really fast and kind of like bridges this gap. I'm, currently stuck in this loop where the product manager asks for some report. I spend a bunch of time putting it into like a spreadsheet or something. I give it back to them. A week later, they ask for this change to the code. You know what I mean? Like the iteration cycles are affecting them. Like they don't want to be stuck in that as well. So, a lot of times for us, even though it's sort of like call it community led in terms of our approach. The right person to be at that community event is more like a senior IC engineer than a director of engineering. At some companies, it's more like a director of engineering. So it's somewhere in between. It's really, this pain is kind of felt across the organization, and it's just, the solutions can be learned by folks at different levels within the organization.
Yeah, take me behind the scenes to one of these dinners a little bit. Like, what are you seeing as the pattern? Like, what are people bringing up a lot in terms of their pains building and testing these systems?
Yeah, it's really evolved, which is really interesting. I remember the very first one we did, everybody was like, should I be building a chatbot? Should I be building like an autocomplete? What's the right form factor? Basically, like it was really product questions, not even really engineering questions. Call it, this was like a little over a year ago when we did our first one. And then there was a kind of a phase after that where it was like, how come OpenAI is down all the time? And, that was kind of the big thing. But then, now it's shifted a lot to like folks trying to get really tactical about very specific issues they're running into. And there are a lot of patterns between them, but it's a lot more like specific engineering centric workflows. So it's like, okay, I have a chatbot that's doing retrieval and I am seeing it like unable to get this type of answer in these situations. And, those types of things are like the type of conversations, and they're a lot more tactical. And I do think that's also shifting a little bit towards like, when do I bring agents in? When do I make that shift from a more like, okay, retrieval generate step to like an agentic flow, for example, and how do I build agents? I think that's one shift that we're also seeing as well.
And how is that affecting the evaluation world, I guess, specifically, right? Like this shift towards agentic systems, how much complexity does that add? Is it really just the same thing in higher volume? Like what does that look like for you?
There are definitely some pretty big differences. What's kind of interesting about that is what you really care at the end of the day about is like the edit that was made to the document, right? It isn't really about like, okay, it came back with a certain response or something like that. And so making sure that you're kind of putting all the context together, which for an agentic application could be a trace. Maybe if you're building an agent that has access to like a search and a scrape tool, and I come in and I say, what are the top places to get brunch in San Francisco? Like maybe the first thing you expect it to do is search Google, or use your search tool and like do a search that's something about brunch places, right? And you can still use existing techniques. Like you could still have an LLM as a judge, like assertion essentially that says, hey, the first thing it did in the trace is it used the search tool and it looked for something that had to do with brunch, right? Like something along those lines. So it's similar, but there are differences. Like it's a lot more about like getting the data, making sure that all of the data is available to really eval the things that really matter, which might not just be the final response from the chatbot.
And so to what extent in that process, because I know Gentrace is focusing a lot on automation, right? Like how do you automate as much of that testing as possible? But as you're also saying, it's like, how do we make that available to the product manager or the subject matter expert who can do some evaluation? What's kind of like the balance there between automation and kind of human in the loop?
We push our users to this workflow where they end up essentially looking at a set of outputs or a trace or something like that. That's kind of what's in the center of the screen. And right next to it, they can actually write very tailored assertions. So this is one form of like what we call an unfair advantage, is like very tailored assertions to particular data points. And then those assertions get essentially saved back to the test data set. And so now what they can do is they can look at the trace, see that something went off the rails, and they can just like assert that shouldn't be happening, right? And they type it right next to it. And anybody can do that. Like a product manager can do that. And, even an educator can come in and do that if you kind of format it the right way, which we help our customers with as well. But essentially it's really simple. It's just like a text box for kind of recording the things that were wrong and some sort of output that you're looking at. And then that becomes a fully automated thing. In the future, anytime it throws that test data in, it's going to use an LLM to judge whether those criteria applied to that thing.
Yeah, that's great. So I guess you could, it does. And so it's just like an increasing level of automation with every feedback cycle, essentially, right? Or like higher quality data as well. And what are you seeing in terms of people's thresholds when it comes to the accuracy of these systems, right? One thing I see a lot is we hold these systems to much higher benchmarks than we would like humans, for sure, when it's like comparable to that. We hold them to lower benchmarks than deterministic software that is 100% accurate and reliable every time, right? So like, do you see a certain area that people tend to fall into, or like, you're trying to get to 100%? Are you being very clear that that's not where you're going to end up though? Like, how are people thinking about that?
Yeah, I think it's a mistake if you're aiming for 100% generally.
Yeah.
I think it's like one thing as we tell our customers, you shouldn't be aiming for 100%. I think what you should be aiming for is very variable depending on the application. Is this thing going to actually take an action for me? Is that action very easily undoable? Can I recover by like going back and forth with the chat a little bit? There's a lot of different factors that go into this question. And essentially that, the question that these teams are really asking themselves is, when should I stop worrying about making it better at the things it already does and start adding more things that it can do, right? And that's sort of the trade-off. And the answer to that question is going to depend a lot on the application, the user feedback you're getting, how undoable are things, a whole bunch of different questions. So it's hard to answer generically. The one smell I can give is, if you're aiming for 100%, that's probably a flag.
Yeah, that's a good call out. Let's get more specific then. Like, let's say you have someone trying to deploy a customer-facing application, right? And then someone deploying like a back-end operations, application, whatever that might be. Do you have any sense of where they might land? If it's like customer-facing, is it like 95%? If it's back-end, they're like 70% is already good enough? Or does it really just, the use case matters so much, and so it's really comes down to that?
The use case matters so much. I can give some sort of like examples to kind of give you a flavor of it. Like if you're, Quizlet and you're generating flashcards and you have a chat interface where the person can iterate on them, you might, care a lot more about increasing capability faster than a bank who's going in and creating an internal tool for support agents to decide whether or not, something's fraud or something like that, right? Like that internal tool might have a much higher threshold for quality than the customer-facing thing that, and for another company, depending on, what are the stakes, how undoable are things, and I think it's kind of a business decision more than it is an AI decision at that point about what you're comfortable taking a risk with.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think you're right. The use case is so key to that. I mean, can you walk us through a case, for example, where AI testing kind of transformed how a customer was approaching AI deployment?
Yeah, I've chatted a little bit about Quizlet. I think like where they were when we started working with them is they had some spreadsheets that they were semi-automatically generating using Jupyter notebooks. There were like one or two ML engineers who really understood that deeply. And they were generating the spreadsheets because they had to have some artifact for other folks to get involved. Because at the end of the day, like any company who's serious is going to have some degree of oversight. It's not just going to be like an engineer shipping an AI system directly to production, right? And so they were spending all this time getting that to work, and they had this really gnarly iteration cycle. And what we were able to do with them is increase testing by 40x. So they're generating those reports 40 times more often. A lot of times when an engineer is going in and individually editing things, the LLM as a judge is sufficient for them to be able to make progress, but then they still have human review ultimately when they make a significant change and they want, and they need that level of oversight. So it just like takes the iteration time way down and the organizational trust way up in what you're shipping. If you set up evals that work and also that are collaborative and everybody can look at and understand that they work and contribute to make it work even better.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, what's a good signal for you, I guess, that a company is ready to get serious about this, right? Because everyone is trying to ship stuff, everyone's evaluating use cases just on a more intuitive level, but like what's the point where you feel like, okay, they're ready to use something like Gentrace?
I think that companies that are serious about getting to like basically that have a POC that everybody is excited about, but the engineer who is working on it is constantly playing Whac-A-Mole, is not able to, or like is building evals, but like the product manager is still very quickly finding issues in it. I think that's the point where you really need a tool that, and like a lot of, what'll end up happening at most of these companies is the engineer will try and build it, some version of this in-house. It'll probably be something like if they're a Python shop, they'll build a Jupyter notebook that exports a spreadsheet or something along those lines. But you really want you need a tool that brings everybody in to be able to look and introspect into those things at that point. Just brings the cycle down so much on iteration and allows you to get to production. And now they're in a point where they're in that add capability mode. They launched it. It was successful. Didn't have the hiccups that a lot of these AI systems have when they launch. It was a very successful launch. And now they're able to like start working on adding capabilities and just making it more powerful. And they know if they're going to regress because they have the evals in place, so they can do that with confidence.
Yeah, that's great. And I guess from your perspective, that faster innovation cycles, more product launches means more usage of your product, right? So that's a win-win for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all very tightly closed together. The iteration cycle, confidence in the AI system, organizational transparency, and having all these stakeholders involved. It's all very deeply interwoven, and it all kind of moves together as you get the right system in place.
Yeah, that's one thing I've seen many people on this show talk about, is that confidence in the system, right? And that it doesn't matter if that system gets it right 3,000 times, if it's a critical use case and it gets it wrong once, like you can erode trust that's been built up over years of functioning properly. And so, yeah, I can see why this is going to become more and more important for a ton of companies. Looking forward a little bit, as models get more complex, as maybe agentic systems get more complex, how do you see evaluation and testing evolving?
Yeah, I think like we're kind of seeing, with DeepSeek, with, the Gemini models are now getting really, really good, like the Gemini reasoning models. As more and more different systems emerge and different ways of building tools emerge, it increases the complexity, and it gives you, it kind of sort of gives these organizations all these different tools and knobs to turn that they didn't have before. And that's great in a sense because it unlocks a bunch of use cases, but it also in some ways just makes it even harder to sort of control the chaos and like iterate and move fast and all of these things. Because now, imagine you're like, this is happening at a lot of our customers right now. They're being asked like, hey, have you tried the Gemini reasoning model? Because it's pretty affordable, US based, all of those types of things. And, okay, now we need to go and see how that, see what happens with our evals and all of those things. And so if you have the evals in place, it allows you to like adopt these technologies much faster. It allows you to build more capability in, which in turn makes it even more important to have the evals in place, because now you have more capabilities and it's even more possible for regression and all of these other things. So we sort of just see it as like, this ball is rolling down the hill and it's picking up steam. And as it picks up steam, just having the right evaluation system, having testing in place is just going to matter more and more for these different organizations.
Yeah, I guess maybe this is too in the weeds, but I'm curious, DeepSeek is on everyone's mind right now. I know that one of their core innovations was adopting kind of a mixture of experts approach, right? Like reducing the amount of parameters used for each, to generate each accurate output. Does that affect evaluation, or are you really kind of more just looking at like comparing outputs to outputs?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I think you're asking this, but correct me if I'm wrong, in the context of like using DeepSeek as an LLM as a judge.
In terms of understanding traceability in those systems, if it's kind of like passing through multiple parts of the model. I'm, again, I don't know enough about how it works, but I'm just curious to get your take if that's going to affect how you evaluate these systems.
I think it's a little early in terms of like, I think where that might affect things is basically, okay, like let's trace through the reasoning that I went through and like have that be something that's available for eval. I don't think very many companies are there yet. We generally recommend companies start with the end-to-end test. What does your user expect for the app? And like, is the app doing what your user expects? And then you kind of work your way back through the tracing. And so that's like a very deep tracing layer in terms of like the reasoning that the model is going through, which maybe some companies will eventually get to, but like we would pretty much, I don't think most companies are still getting their end-to-end tests right. Just like, hey, when a user comes, for a customer success use case, when a user comes in and asks about this, is it saying the right thing? And then you can work your way back to more and more fine-grained tests. So I think from the perspective of could you use that for evaluation and get something out of it, I think you probably could, but I would recommend to anybody who's listening to this podcast that they start with, make sure they have their end-to-end really good, and then they work their way down to more and more specific things. In terms of like, how does it affect evaluation, it's something that we're actively researching right now, is basically like, can these models allow you to do more and more powerful LLM as a judge type evaluations and kind of change the way that, with reasoning models in general, like change the way, kind of unlock a whole bunch of different new LLM as a judge applications. We're hoping to have some sort of like report where we talk about this out in like February or March. It's a little early to say what that is, but that's something that we're like researching right now as a team.
Oh, very cool. I will definitely look out for that. That's interesting to me. Even as a non-technical person, I find this stuff fascinating. And I like that you distinguish makes sense to me that you really have to start with comparing kind of output to expected behavior, and not go deep into tracing all of the decisions that are going on there, because I think there's a lot to uncover there, but it makes for a much more complex evaluation. I think one thing that we'll definitely see with DeepSeek, and obviously the fact that it's open source, is just a lot more adoption of this, right? As like the costs go down, more and more of this is going to get deployed everywhere. So it's going to be a good time to be in the evaluation space. I mean,
Yeah.
do you think that AI just broadly, I mean, LLMs in particular, is changing like how we should approach software testing just more broadly?
I think it potentially could be. Something that we're investigating right now is using agents to essentially test other agents. So this is something that there's been some research around. I don't think there's a ton of folks doing this in practice, but it's sort of like, I think there's a handful. I think what you mentioned with your customer service company that you chatted with, it sounds like they're kind of doing it. But essentially you give an agent an intent and you have it interact potentially many times with like a chatbot or a voice surface or something like that. And what you're measuring is, does it accomplish the goal or not? Not really like, what is the response? And then there's kind of a question, if you're doing that, like, why couldn't it just like, operator style, just like test your whole web app? Like the agent comes in, like it's a user trying to do something, like, can't it just test traditional software as well? I think it's interesting. I'm very curious to see where that space goes. It's not our main focus because generative AI is so difficult to measure and has all of these stochastic characteristics. Like, that's where we really focus. But I am also asking the same question of like, I would love it for Gentrace if somebody came out and built just like, hey, a great product testing, web app testing solution that uses agents under the hood to do the web app testing, right?
So you could simulate thousands and thousands of tests very quickly and get your customers kind of closer to that accuracy threshold much faster. Yeah.
Yeah. Something, okay, like make sure login is working well, make sure you can go into this page and do these filters and it all works as expected, all of those types of things. I think it's interesting for sure.
Are there any questions in relation to kind of evaluation and testing, or just the industry more broadly, that you think I haven't asked and that we should be talking about more? Like, what aren't people talking about enough in this space? DeepSeek is not one of them, for example, over the last week. I can't get enough of that.
Absolutely. The thing that I still see is, I think a lot of companies are just getting some sort of eval stack up and running, and they are still figuring out that their eval stack is not working. Actually, it's not really doing a great job of capturing user intent. I think there are definitely examples where companies have been very successful doing it. But I think like one of the big themes that I'm kind of predicting for 2025 is there's a lot of companies that have set up eval stacks that are locked in code and like don't have an unfair advantage, are not, they exist and there's like some report at the end about quality, but it's not really accurately measuring how well this thing is going to work. And I think that's going to get uncovered more and more in 2025. I think 2024 was just the year of some people trying to get something in. And 2025 is going to be a lot of companies figuring out that it doesn't actually work. And so I think the conversation that will start to happen more and more is like, what makes a great eval? What is a great eval? What does that actually look like? What are the common themes for a chatbot versus a voice agent versus, an autocomplete? Like, what are how do we test these things well? I think that's sort of the like conversation that will start happening more and more. And it's kind of a more nuanced conversation, but that's where we think the unfair advantages framework is kind of like the right framework to think about the answer to that question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good sign for the industry if you're having more nuanced conversations around, let's not just stand up an evaluation framework, but how do we actually make that much better for our specific use case? That gets us to our very quick lightning round, because, could talk about this stuff for a long time, but we're almost at time. So personally for you, what's the AI tool you use the most?
I'm kind of tied between ChatGPT and Cursor right now. Cursor, we've started using for things you wouldn't expect. Like we have our blog posts in a GitHub repo and we edit them in Cursor because it's so nice just having that conversational agent right next to the thing that you're editing. Obviously, ChatGPT and like Anthropic have their concept of like a canvas.
Yeah.
but it rewrites it all from scratch anytime you make a change. So they really need to fix that. It really needs to edit the document, not just redo the whole thing from scratch anytime you try and make a change to anything. Maybe then we'll go back to using those for that. But it's interesting, like that form factor where you have an agent, a chat agent next to something that's making edits, and it's really doing edits, not just doing a restart from scratch. I think that's something that we'll see more and more of as time goes on.
Yeah, I love that. It's one thing that I think gets overlooked a lot of the times when we talk about AI tooling is just like conversational and is not the best interface for certain workflows, right? You don't want to be constantly dealing with chat. And like, it's amazing because it's so intuitive and it's unlocked, it's kind of democratized access to a lot of this stuff, but it's also just not ideal in many ways. There's reasons that product managers have built beautiful like experiences and products. So hopefully we don't revert all back to chat, and I'm excited to see what happens in this space. It is a space that's moving very quickly. Are there any specific resources that you really like for staying up to date on what's going on?
I mostly have like a series of accounts that I follow that I think are really good for just like keeping up on the latest research. I kind of go from those to pieces of content that are maybe longer form pieces of content. This could be anything from like research papers to blog posts or things like that. There's a handful of accounts that I think are really good. I think like, I don't know if you know, I don't know if his name's pronounced Hamel or Hamel, but Hussein on Twitter, I think does a really good job of like capturing a lot of the trends that are going on. And he's an AI consultant, so he's seeing a lot of companies. I think there's a few other accounts that I'm happy to like dig up and share with you afterwards in terms of ones that I think are really good at summarizing things. Then of course, like, we're trying our best to put out our own research around this as well, and definitely would encourage the audience here to stay tuned for our report on what are the best models for different kinds of evals and things like that. And obviously, everybody should be following you as you this inspiration of like what are AI startups thinking about, what are CIOs and CTOs thinking about, because you're going to get right into the middle of it. So.
Well, I appreciate that shout out on my own show, Doug. So I'll make sure people are following me. And yeah, if we publish this after your report comes out, we'll also make sure to link it in the show notes for anyone who's interested. Or we can share that with the group later. Last question. What is a phrase or idea that you recently heard that really stuck with you?
This is going to sound a little bit pedantic, but I think like the definition of an agent is something that is really hard to get right. And I think like classically the definition of an agent is that it's something that like takes actions on your behalf. But Anthropic actually had a blog post where they talked about building agents, and they used a definition which was something to the effect of like an agent is something where the LLM kind of controls the flow of the application. And I think that's more the way that people are using agents today. Like that's like the meaning that people really mean when they say I'm building an agent, more so than something that can take actions on my behalf. Obviously there are things that do both. And so I just thought that was like a really good definition of an agent. And I kind of hope that we as an industry kind of standardize on something like that so that we can reduce the ambiguity of what we all mean when we're talking about agents.
Yeah, I think that would be fantastic because there's a lot of stuff you see out there masquerading as agentic AI that is definitely just like basic business process orchestration and like automation tooling. And there is also, I think one mental model that has really helped me think about it is just this idea of like tasking, agents, you give them a goal and then they go and perform the actions to achieve that goal versus you having to define the process by which they do all of that necessarily. And that's very, very broad too. But I think like the more that we start shifting towards thinking about defining goals versus defining process is, like more, I guess, declarative programming versus procedural programming, that sort of thing. I mean, there's a lot of interesting, it's going to be a space to watch very closely. Doug, that's all we have time for today, but I've really enjoyed this. If our listeners want to hear more about your work, where should they go? Yeah, so they can follow me directly on LinkedIn or X/Twitter. We do have a newsletter. They can go to our website and sign up for our newsletter. Our newsletter will focus both on like the product releases that we're doing as well as the thought pieces that we're doing and the research that we're doing on our end. So either of those are great ways to follow along with us. Amazing. Well, that was Doug Safreno from Gentrace. Go check him out on LinkedIn or Twitter and go check out the company at gentrace.ai. Doug, thank you so much for joining the show. Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Ben. Yeah, it's been a pleasure.